In this video, I'm going to discuss the construction techniques used in creating the breast welt pocket in a man's coat. We're going to be following the steps as outlined in Classic Tailoring Techniques, the book by Roberto Cabrera and Patricia Flattery Myers, starting on page 68. The slanted breast welt pocket is usually about 4.5 inches wide, about an inch tall. It's usually about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches from the arm's eye seam, and it needs to be nicely framed here with a space between the end of the welt and the lapel, the edge of the lapel. This is on about a 1/2 inch slant, meaning the front edge of it is lower than this side. This placement and these dimensions will of course vary from coat to coat depending on the size of the chest. You'll need to study menswear to know what looks pleasing. So let's see how that translates now into the flat paper pattern. So this is the paper pattern for a size 40 regular, and you can see that the welt pocket, if we line this up on the straight of grain, this ruler, you can see that the welt pocket is indeed on a 1/2 inch slant to the front, and that it's placed about 1.5 inches from the arm's eye seam. When the lapel is folded back, you can see that the welt pocket is framed nicely with about 1 inch of space there. So that's the placement of the welt. The welt pattern itself is a mirror image of the welt placement. I like to indicate which way is the front end just so that no one gets confused. And when we cut that welt, we'll be cutting it with 3/8 inch of seam allowance here, but that's in the next step. The other patterning piece is the pocketing that makes the bag, that makes the pocket itself. And it's a 6 by 6 inch square of pocketing on the straight of grain, that's the front edge, and the top edge mirrors that 1/2 inch slant. The first thing we'll cut is the interfacing for the welt. We want to firm up that welt because it's on the bias or on a slight slant, and we don't want it to be stretching out. Depending on your fabric, you might use a heavyweight fusible, cotton woven fusible, or you might move up to a fusible acro for a little firmer look. This is what we're going to be using for the wool that I'm working with today. Cut the welt interfacing on the straight of grain, ignoring the 1/2 inch slant for now. You're going to want to cut exactly at the paper pattern edge on the two sides and the top. We don't want the interfacing to go into those seams, but we do want to retain this 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance here at the bottom. We'll be using that to firm up that seam line. I cut, even though we're making one breast welt pocket on the gentleman's left side, I cut 2 layers and figure out the left side, right side conundrum in the next couple steps. So what is the left side, right side conundrum, you may well ask? Well, here are my 2 pieces of fusible acro. The fusible is on the inside, and I've drawn the line here that delineates the welt from the 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I've initialed F for front. So you might think that this would be the interfacing you use for this coat, except that the fusible is on this side. So here I'm taking my front and putting it over here, and the slant is going the wrong way. So actually, the in the left side, right side conundrum is this. Straight pin the fusible hymo onto the wool. Using straight pins means you can get the ruler on there easily and chalk mark your seam allowance 3/8 inch on each side but 5/8 inch seam allowance up at the top. You already have the 3/8 inch seam allowance on the bottom, so you don't have to add seam allowance there. Cut the wool flush with the fusible. Once you have the welt cut, then cut 2 layers of pocketing, 6 inches by 6 inches with the 1/2 inch slant. You don't have to add seam allowance to that. Next, pull those pins out so that when you iron, you don't leave a pin mark, and carefully steam and then fuse that fusible interfacing onto the wool. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to be creating a sample as we walk through these steps. It's always a good idea if you're new to creating welt pockets to do a sample to make sure you have your precision skills up to speed. So now we're ready to start sewing. With one of the pocketing pieces, keeping the slanted edge up, align the top of the welt pocket centered on that edge, pin and stitch at 1/4 inch from the raw edge. This is what it looks like when you've stitched it, and then you want to press the welt away from the pocketing and press both layers of that seam toward the pocketing. You might notice that I have writing on here. This is because these pieces that I'm about to show you step by step are my teaching samples. Once you have that seam pressed toward the pocketing, you want to fold the wool along the upper edge of that fusible hymo. You don't want to go too far or stop too short. It needs to be precisely at the edge of that fusible hymo. Once you have that folded perfectly, you want to scooch in, yes, that's a technical term, a little bit of the welt so that it bows ever so slightly, just that much. What that does is the same thing as roll pinning. We're going to stitch the ends here next and then turn this, and what the roll does right there, this little extra, is causes the seams that are on the end to roll to the inside of the welt so that we don't see them. It's a really nice technique. When you're stitching the end, back stitch at the upper corner, come down and back stitch there at that 3/8 inch line. Don't stitch further than that. We're going to need that seam allowance free in a next step, so why stitch it down now? Once you have that stitched and back stitched, clip the excess and then clip into that corner here, because we'll want this free while we turn and bag out the edge of the welt. So let's turn that welt, pulling out those corners so that they are true corners, and then ironing them so that they are crisp and clean this way. And then here's that clip, and there's our seam allowance that we can have access to in the next step or two. Having prepared the welt, now we need to prepare the coat front, or in this case, the sample that is representing the coat front. On the inside, the wrong side, I like to put a little piece of lightweight fusible just to firm up the area that the welt will sit in. And then I like to machine a stitch, machine stay stitch right on the welt placement line so that I can see that on the outside. Once you have that machine stay stitched so that you can see it, this is the right side that the audience will see. This is the right side of the welt that the audience will see. So, placing the welt and the coat right sides together, line up this 3/8 inch, this stitching line with the placement line, making sure to match the front corners and match the side corners. At this point, I like to run my pins along the stitching line this way, because if you have a plaid welt, this would be the time when you can check to see if your plaids are matching. That way you can at least have a running start at getting those plaids matched. Once you have your welt placed, then you can cross pin and proceed to the sewing machine and stitch the welt in place. Once you have the welt stitched in place, you can again make sure that it hasn't slipped during the stitching process in case you need to check on your plaid. Once you have that where you want it to be, it's time to place the second piece of pocketing. Remember that 1/2 inch slant. So the lower edge, lower corner of that slant is the front, and this is the front. So we need to turn that around, and I like to slide that under the 3/8 seam allowance, line it up with the other pocketing, and pin it in place. You'll take that to the sewing machine and machine stitch along just at the 3/8 inch away from the other stitching line, but not catching this seam allowance. You're going to just stitch from here, the welt opening, to the other welt opening. You may need to trim the corners at this point. It's also at this point that you want to make sure that this stitching line, this second stitching line that holds this pocketing on, ends perfectly parallel with the first stitching line that holds the welt on. You want these to be perfectly stopping at the same point on each side of your welt here. Once you've achieved that, then it's time to pull this back and cut along the center. You want to cut along the center, stopping about 1/2 inch from the ends, and then cut into the corners of those two stitching lines. Do that on each end, and then this is when the magic happens. You'll reach through that opening, pull all of that pocketing through to the wrong side, being very careful to not distort the ends here at each end. The pocket bags go down. All of this gets arranged and flat. Those little triangles at the ends that you clipped into the two corners, they need to stick out here and be flat. And there's the beginning of your finished breast welt pocket. We need to make sure that these triangles are flat, that everything is laying flat, otherwise you'll end up with a lumpy product, and that's not what we're about. Then, the most important thing to remember when you take this to the ironing board, I'm going to turn it so that you can maybe see a little better looking at it this way. Do you see how the welt is here and the wool is wanting to bubble up and around? We don't want that. We want a welt pocket. Let me show you with the finished sample. We want a welt pocket that lays on a flat, the same plane as the coat front. To achieve that, what we need to do is iron this seam allowance open. So taking this to the ironing board, flip this out of the way, flip this out of the way, and this is where the clipping of the corners on the seam allowance will set you up nicely for this. You want to work that seam allowance open like that, and with the tip of your iron that flat. This is critical. So here you can see that that seam has been nicely pressed flat and open, and you can see now there is no bubble here. This is now where you'll want to turn it from the right side and make sure to arrange your seam allowances here and make sure that point on each end, I'll turn this so you can see it, so that point on each end is sticking out nicely. So what we're going to do next is lift the coat up here and stitch down here, catching that little triangle, stitching down just through the pocketing across the bottom, and then up the other side, catching that triangle on this side to create the pocket bag. Once that's done, you can trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch, and then it's time to hand stitch down very securely the ends of the welt. And you can see once that's done, because we had that bow in it, we sort of roll pinned it back when we bagged out the two ends. You can see here we don't see the seam at all. It looks seamless. Give it a good press. Sometimes people like to do a machine top stitching at the end of the welt to secure that. That's fine. Or you can just secure it very nicely by hand, very secure. And that's your welt pocket.